The main reason for the Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783, this is celebrated on 4th of July, is because a man called King George III passed the Quebec Act in 1774, which gave Christians in Canada freedom to practice their religion. It removed all the anti-Catholic British penal laws. This upset the colonists enormously. The Declaration of Independence, it was written in July 1776, but all signatures were finally completed in the early 1780s, complained that the king abolished, quote, the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, and that Canada would become, quote, an instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. It was illegal to be a Christian in 10 of the 13 original colonies. In the remaining 3 conditions were harsh, and Christians were forced to pay 2 to 3 times the amount of taxes despite being the poorest group and being denied civil services, benefits and citizenship. Justice for damaged property, theft, destroyed churches, mob violence, mass murder and lynchings was denied by the courts on the following grounds: you are foreigners, your allegiance is to the Pope, and you are not citizens, which is all true because Christianity does not give fealty to the USA, but only to the vicars of Christ. The US isn't a nation but an anti-Christian interfaith religion, nevertheless justice should apply to all. The judicial injustices I mentioned continued even into the late 1800s. Yes. Higher taxation for Christians, 0 civil benefits in return, police and firefighters refusing to help during emergencies and refusing to arrest violent criminals targeting Christians. Over 80,000 colonialists, including Christians, and they believe in being subject to the higher powers that are legitimate, were killed for their loyalty to George III. American rebels committed terrorist acts against people who wanted no involvement in war. The anti-Christianity and terrorism of entitled, slave-owning wealthy Freemason American rebels is framed as a fight for liberty. Satanist and Freemason Benjamin Franklin, who was the Grand Master of a French lodge, raised millions of francs crucial to financing George Washington's army. He was the first to submit a plan for military collaboration and political federation with French Freemasonry. He established a chain of Masonic newspapers in all of the colonies, which inspired sedition against George III and made terrorist threats of death against those who did not want to fight. The Revolutionary War was cleverly engineered into a fight between Britain and France. The American army units were totally ineffectual and inexperienced. There was even infighting between the various militia units because of lack of provisions. Many members of an army unit were even starving. George Washington led a ragtag army. He organized many military lodges and personally participated in their activities. He was a 32nd degree Freemason at the time. All the leading generals of his army were Freemasons. The wealthy leaders of American army units received the spoils of war and all the glory that belongs to France, which bankrupted itself fighting Britain. The framers of the Constitution consolidated wealth, power, and control. Thousands of slaves fought ferociously on both sides of the Revolutionary War. Slaves were a massive help to Americans on both sides of the war. They were even made the pilots of warships in the navies and handled ammunition. When George III stopped persecuting Christians in Canada, the so-called Declaration of Independence considered it intolerable and denounced the decision in an Orwellian manner. Letter of the Revolutionary Congress, September 5, 1774, to England concerning the Quebec Act. The legislature of Great Britain is not authorized by the Constitution to establish a religion fraught with sanguinary and impious tenets, or to erect an arbitrary form of government in any quarter of the globe. The Dominion of Canada is to be so disunited from us, detached from our interests by civil as well as religious prejudices, that by their numbers daily swelling with Catholic immigrants from Europe, and by their devotion to an administration so friendly to their religion, they might become formidable to us, and on occasion be fit instruments in the hands of power to reduce the ancient, free Protestant colonies to slavery. This was evidently the object of the act, and in this view, being extremely dangerous to our liberty and quiet, we cannot forbear complaining of it as hostile to British America. We cannot help deploring the unhappy condition, nor can we suppress our astonishment that a British Parliament should ever consent to establish in that country a religion that has deluged your island in blood and dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world. Holton Woody, on page 29 of his book, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, wrote, "To finance their war against British taxation without representation, Americans had committed themselves to higher taxes than they had ever faced as British colonists. After the war, taxes in most states remained 3 or 4 times higher than colonial levels. In the colony of Rhode Island, annual revenue needs seldom exceeded £2,000. 2 years after the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty, however, the Assembly imposed a tax with a face value of £20,000 and an actual value, in gold and silver, of about £11,000. In 1786, the year of Shays' Rebellion, the portion of Massachusetts farmers' income consumed by taxation was 4 to 5 times higher than it had been under British rule. Historian Max Isaac Damon, The Jews in America, page 59, takes the British point of view. Viewing the Revolution with hindsight, one finds little to quarrel about with the English. Actually, the colonies had borne no more than a third of the cost of the French and Indian Wars, and England 2/3. In 1775, the per capita tax on the British was 50 times that paid by the Americans. The Sugar and Stamp Acts imposed on the Americans were mild compared to those levied on the British. The cry, "No taxation without representation," disguised the issues. The colonists were objecting to a potential tyranny rather than an actual one. They were looking for a reason to rebel, rather than being pushed into rebellion. In fact, after the war, the Americans had to tax themselves more severely than the British had. The framers of the Constitution were wealthy tyrannical landowners in the colonies. According to historian Woody Holton, in his book Unruly Americans, during the time that the Articles of Confederation were in effect in the colonies from 1781 to 1789, mobs of ex-soldiers, farmers, and foreclosed upon taxpayers. Laid siege to state legislatures demanding relief. They closed courts to prevent foreclosures and otherwise engaged in massive grassroots resistance to tax collection efforts. There was high inflation. The legislatures of the colonies paid their debts with promissory notes, bonds, and scrip instead of actual currency, and then demanded that the general public pay a high amount of taxes in actual currency of gold and silver. The public was very angry. Unruly Americans, farmers, soldiers, taxpayers, speculators, creditors, and entrepreneurs are the main reason the Constitution appears the way it does. Rebellions happened in almost all the colonies, and the framers of the Constitution were constrained to write what they did, out of fear of being overthrown. The Constitution took effect on March 4, 1789. They deeply feared the masses taking their hands off the levers of power. Therefore, the framers compromised on, quote, citizens' rights due to massive resistance, sometimes violent, to keep them in check. They did not want the public to have a say or influence in government affairs. The framers of the Constitution were partially successful. Taking power away from the states and ultimately away from the people would serve to protect and increase the vast wealth of the framers and their rich associates and make investment attractive. The surge of popular democracy threatened the financial interests of the framers. Average Americans are the ones who ensured that their personal liberties were codified. They literally put fear into the out-of-touch establishment and caused it to change the system. However, falsified American history glorifies and gives credit to the framers, and promotes the absurdly ridiculous story that the American army was vastly outnumbered by the British and overcame overwhelming odds. During the Revolutionary War, Britain was already fighting many wars and rebellions throughout the world to maintain its empire. Its manpower and resources were stretched thin. It was therefore already vulnerable to losing the war to France. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief of all the land forces during the Revolutionary War, was a Freemason. He was the top general in the entire British military. He allowed George Washington to escape on numerous occasions when he had him in his hands. The war would have been over quickly. William Howe also went to Conakry, Philadelphia when he needed to go to Albany, New York to see British General John Burgoyne. The British Army leadership was Freemasonic, including Brigadier General Augustine Prevost and 34 senior colonels. What made the difference for the American rebels was the intervention of France. Spain, the Netherlands, and Hyder Ali, the Sultanate king in southern India. This turned the Revolutionary War into a world war on American soil. The British not only found themselves being sabotaged by Freemasons within the military, but were fighting the American rebel army, and also fighting in the West Indies, Africa, in India and the high seas. Since there was a fight between France and Britain, it was a global war because they had colonies all over the world involved in the fighting. Britain and France were attacking and taking over military outposts in each other's colonies. Britain suffered heavy losses and so did their opponents. Then the final nail in the coffin was Catherine the Great, forming the League of the Armed Neutrality, which brought Russia, the Scandinavian countries, the Holy Roman Empire, and Naples into a bloc. That finally towards the very end threatened to declare war on Britain if the Revolutionary War did not end. This is the reason George III felt forced to end the war. George III felt betrayed that Spain and France came to the aid of his rebellious subjects, who wanted to establish a republic in America during the Revolutionary War. This made him turn against the Catholic Church, even though the Church is not responsible for what monarchs, likely influenced by Freemasons, do, and does not involve itself in wars with the exception of the Crusades. Thus, George III did not rescind the anti-Catholic penal laws of Britain, even though he had been moving towards that direction. An organization cannot escape its founding principles. History shows that tyrannical American government and political corruption can only be reformed by vast armed populist uprisings of an angry public led by former soldiers, that closes courthouses, attempts to seize and occupy government buildings and weapons depots. Shays' Rebellion was an uprising of 4,000 people led by Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays against the Massachusetts government, due to excessive tax, without representation mind you, and aggressive tax and debt collection, cronyism, widespread corruption, economic oppression by the wealthy and their government agents, and mass theft of lands and possessions by the corrupt judiciary. The rebellion spread to neighboring states. Shays wanted to overthrow and reform the state government. His rebellion lasted 7 months. It began August 1886 and ended February 1887. The state's army had casualties and so did Shays' army of farmers. Even though Shays' Rebellion was defeated by privately funded militias of the wealthy and also the Massachusetts government army, it caused the wealthy framers of the Constitution to convene a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in May of 1887. It created the Constitution of the United States. The framers knew that the colonies were vulnerable to violent rebellions that could overthrow them. The level of tyranny and corruption going on today is far worse than the tyranny that spurred numerous rebellions in the colonies, and which led to the creation of the Constitution. The four wealthiest men in the colonies in 1775 were George Washington, John Hancock, Charles Carroll Carrollton, and Philip John Schuyler. All of them were generals in the Revolutionary War. Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, the Freemason, gave the Statue of Liberty, which is an androgen, as a gift from French Freemasons to USA Freemasons. It represents the half-dressed prostitute holding the torch of Lucifer, who was installed in Notre Dame Cathedral during the height of the French Revolution, and worshipped as the goddess of reason. America embraces and celebrates an anti-Christian symbol. It is said the prostitute was meant to be a live representation of the goddess of witchcraft, Isis, also known as the goddess of liberty, also known as the ancient mother of harlots, and is known as Ishtar among ancient Babylonians, Athena in Greece, Astarte in Syria, Cybele in Rome, Ashtoreth in ancient Palestine, and Diana in Ephesus. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom were presidents, one right after the other, and were also generals in the Revolutionary War, both died on July 4, 1826. July 4th is a significant date. John Adams died at the age of 90 in Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson died at the age of 83 in Virginia.
There is one more significant insight as to why this nation's founding fathers chose the date of July the 4th to declare America's independence from Great Britain. Babylonians in the past celebrated that night by lighting bonfires to Baal, their sun god. And Americans light fires in the sky called fireworks after sunset on July the 4th. Observers will quickly note that this is the only American holiday that is traditionally celebrated by fireworks. So here we see a connection between the celebration of July the 4th and sun worship. So the founding fathers concealed a holiday to the sun god in the choice of the date of July the 4th to declare their independence from Great Britain. It appears that many things once thought unexplainable have an explanation after all. Revelation 12, chapter 12, verse 9. That old serpent called the devil was Satan, and Satan was cast out into the earth. And the reason this is significant is because whole cultures all over the earth have been worshiping the serpent or the snake in their religions. So please keep that in mind as we examine the following evidence. William Josiah Sutton, in his book entitled The Illuminati 666, added another very important piece of the puzzle to the story. This is what he wrote. The ancient Mayans, meaning the Mayan Indian tribe of the Yucatan in Mexico, a peninsula on the northeast side of Mexico, worshipped the serpent god under the name of Kan. Here we find the origin of the American word canny, shrewd, or serpent-like. The Babylonians worshipped Kan or Kan, the serpent, and Baal, the god of fire. The Romans combined the words into Vulcan, the god of fire, from whence comes our word volcano. This seems to be how the Mayans and the Mexicans named their gods. They too combined two words to describe their serpent god. Hence, Kulkul means beautiful bird, and Kan means serpent. Kulkulkan means bird serpent in the Mayan language. This is the exact same meaning for Quetzalcoatl, the Mexican god. The cosmic symbol for Quetzalcoatl was a feathered serpent. The statement that Quetzalcoatl was the god of the Mexicans was partially confirmed in this photograph of an Indian dancing with a snake in his mouth. The caption underneath the picture reads in part, "The snake represents the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl." There was one similarity between all of these cultures. They worshipped the serpent god. I would like to start the discussion with this drawing that shows the Mayan Queen Mu as a child consulting the soothsayer. It shows the queen is receiving the words from their serpent god, but through the mouth of a soothsayer. The queen is shown on the left side of the drawing inside the red rectangle with her left hand on her face as she is seated facing the soothsayer. She is depicted as a young child, perhaps in her early teens. The soothsayer is shown in the green rectangle as she is seated in front of the queen with what appears to be a little table between them. She is shown in front of two other women and two huts. Behind the soothsayer is the yellow rectangle. In the yellow rectangle is a huge serpent which towers above the scene. Notice that it has its mouth open, and if it is speaking to the soothsayer, as if it is speaking to the soothsayer and the queen as well. The book that included this drawing in the pages said that the winged serpent behind her represented the protective genius of the Mayan Empire. So the snake serpent protected the Mayans. This is a representation of Prince Ko of the Mayans in the heat of battle. His head is near the center of the drawing, and behind him and taller than it appears to be the winged serpent, also representing the protective genius of the Mayan Empire. So the serpent was an important part of the worship of the Mayan and Aztec people, which means that it was an important part of the South American culture before the earliest Europeans landed in America. The American people have been told by the majority of the historians who have examined this nation's past that the name America was named after Amerigo Vespucci, supposedly the navigator for Christopher Columbus. But there is an alternative explanation. William Still, in his book entitled New World Order, offers the following explanation. The name America may be the product of secret societies. In an 1895 magazine named Lucifer, James Price gave an insight into the meaning of the word America. He said that the supreme god of the Mayan culture of Central America, known as Quetzalcoatl elsewhere, was known as Amaru in Peru. Amaru's territory was known as Amaracu. According to Price, from the latter comes the word America. America is translated land of the serpent. Mr. Price was not the only one to make this claim. Robert B. Stacy Mudd wrote a book entitled Atlantis, Mother of Empires, in which he attempts to make the claim that the Mayans came from the nation known as Atlantis, an island that allegedly sank during an earthquake. Now, this is not the place to examine his charges, but he does draw another startling conclusion. Quetzalcoatl, the Mayan god, was known as Kukulkan amongst the Aztecs. In Peru, he was known as Amaru. But all of these names have an identical meaning, the feathered serpent. From the Peruvian name comes America. This is a photograph of a feathered serpent in the 33rd degree Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C. Notice that the head of the serpent has wings. It is a feathered serpent. The feathered serpent would have flown from the old world to the new world, meaning America. By the way, notice that the swastika in the ornamental metalwork above the feathered serpent shown under the two red arrows. The swastika is also a symbol of the sun god and may be drawn two ways, one the reverse of the other. One way is called the evil swastika and the other is called the good swastika. This is a photograph of the swastika, the official symbol of Adolf Hitler's Nazi party. Notice that this is the evil form of the swastika, and it has been reported that Hitler knew the difference between the two forms of the symbol and that he intentionally selected this, the evil form. It was under this sun god symbol utilized by Adolf Hitler in the war that his government started that Hitler killed 53 million people under the sign of the sun god, the concealed Lucifer, Satan, or the devil. Mr. Steele adds one of the thoughts of another writer who claims to know the truth about the origin of the name America. It is important to note that not only are the people living in the United States of America Americans, all of the people who live in the New World are Americans. The continents are called North America and South America, and regions are called Latin America and Central America. Here is the official position as written by Manly P. Hall, one of the greatest Masons of all time, in his book entitled America's Assignment. Since the serpent is frequently a symbol of Lucifer, it is no exaggeration to extrapolate from this that America may well mean, please America, hold on, this is not going to be pleasant, land of Lucifer, also called Satan, the devil. So that revelation that America was named after Amaru, another name for the feathered serpent god. And the feathered serpent is a symbol of Lucifer, another name for Satan, the devil, is quite possibly the true explanation of the naming of America. I am convinced that all of what we have studied so far has convinced me that America was named after Lucifer by our founding fathers. That means that this nation's founding fathers knew that. They were announcing the birth of the New World Order when they dedicated this nation to Lucifer, also known as Satan or the devil. They knew who America was named after. That is why they placed the Great Pyramid, a symbol of the temple of initiation, into Lucifer worship and the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States. That is why they placed the Eye of Osiris, the sun god, concealing worship of Lucifer above his house on the reverse side of the Great Seal. That is why they waited to form this nation after there were 13 states. That is why they selected the American eagle as this nation's national bird. That is why they declared their independence on July 4th, a concealed sun holiday.